On the morning of July 8, 1944, American commanders walked into a scene on the island of Saipan that defied all military logic. They were standing in the aftermath of the largest suicidal banzai charge in the history of the Pacific War. The jungle floor was carpeted with thousands of bodies, a gruesome mosaic of mud, blood, and twisted metal. But amidst this slaughter, one specific foxhole stopped the generals cold. They found a forward aid station, a medical tent meant for healing, not killing, and slumped over a heavy machine gun, dead from 76 separate bayonet and bullet wounds, was a man named Benjamin Salomon. He wasn't a ranger. He wasn't a Marine commando. He was a dentist. A man who had spent his life fixing cavities and worrying about gum disease. But what lay around his lifeless body shattered reality. Piled in front of his machine gun, clogging the tent entrance, and stacked inside the medical station itself were the bodies of 98 Japanese soldiers. One man, one dentist. 98 confirmed kills. The math didn't make sense. A dentist isn't trained to fight a battalion. But on that night, Ben Salomon didn't just fight. He became the most lethal man on the island of Saipan. How does a gentleman trained to save lives end up ending nearly 100 of them in a single hour? To understand the nightmare of that morning, we have to go back to the hell that created it. Most heroes are born in fire, but Ben Salomon was born in Milwaukee. If you looked at him in 1937, you would see the least dangerous man in America. He was quiet, unassuming, an Eagle Scout who obeyed every rule and wrote letters to his mother. He was studying dentistry at the University of Southern California, worrying about exams and root canals while the rest of the world held its breath for war. Friends described him as the guy you'd want as a neighbor, reliable, soft-spoken, incapable of violence. When the draft notice came in 1940, Ben didn't run. He joined the infantry. And here is the first strange twist of fate in a story full of them. This quiet dentist turned out to be a prodigy with a rifle. In basic training, he picked up a weapon and scored expert marksman. He picked up a pistol and scored expert again. His commanding officers were baffled. They had a natural-born shooter on their hands, a man with ice water in his veins and perfect hand-eye coordination. But the Army, in its infinite bureaucracy, looked at his college degree and made a decision. His hands were too valuable for a trigger. They belonged in a mouth. Ben was transferred to the Dental Corps. He was assigned to the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. They called themselves the New York Division, but the Marines fighting alongside them had a different name for them. They called them the Shopkeepers. The 27th had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. They were seen as slow, cautious, lacking the killer instinct needed for the brutal, island-hopping campaign against the Japanese Empire. Ben Salomon was a dentist in a division that everyone else thought was soft. But they were headed for an island that would break the hardest men on Earth. Saipan. It wasn't just another jungle rock in the middle of the ocean. To the Japanese High Command, this was the final line of defense. It was considered part of the Japanese homeland. If the Americans took Saipan, their new B-29 Superfortress bombers would be within range of Tokyo itself. The Emperor knew this. The generals knew this, and the 31,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island were given a simple, terrifying order. No surrender. Every man dies fighting. Every man takes 10 Americans with him. Into this meat grinder walked the dentist. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. If history remembers Omaha Beach as a nightmare, Saipan was the apocalypse. The Japanese had pre-sighted every inch of the landing zone with artillery and mortars. When Ben Salomon waded ashore with the 105th Infantry, the lagoon was already red with blood. But Ben wasn't on the front line. Not yet. As the regimental dentist, his job was to stay back, set up a sterile tent, and pull infected teeth. He was supposed to treat gum infections caused by the tropical heat and stress. But war rarely follows a job description. The casualties in the first week were catastrophic. The American advance was brutal, yard by bloody yard, against an enemy that refused to retreat. Within days, the 2nd Battalion's chief surgeon was wounded by shrapnel. The replacement surgeon was killed instantly by a sniper. Suddenly, the 105th Infantry had hundreds of wounded men pouring in and no doctor to treat them. This is the moment Ben Salomon stopped being just a dentist. He stepped forward and told the commanding officer, "I can do it." He put down his dental mirror and picked up a scalpel. For weeks, he worked 20-hour shifts. He wasn't fixing teeth anymore. He was digging jagged metal out of legs, sewing up chest wounds, and holding the hands of boys dying in the mud. He learned triage in the dark. He learned to ignore the screaming. It is critical to understand this transformation. Ben Salomon spent weeks saving lives. He saw the horror of what Japanese weapons did to American bodies. Every boy who died on his table, every letter home he had to write for a deceased soldier, it changed him. The gentle dentist was hardening. The Eagle Scout was seeing the raw face of evil. And somewhere inside him, the expert marksman was waking up. By early July, the Americans had pushed the Japanese army to the northern tip of the island, to a place called the Tanapag Plain. The Japanese were trapped against the sea. They were starving. They were out of ammunition. They were eating snails and tree bark to survive. Logic dictated that they should surrender. Any other army in the world would have raised the white flag. But the Imperial Japanese Army did not operate on logic. They operated on the Code of Bushido. On July 6th, the situation had become desperate for the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshisugu Saito. He was sick, frail, and living in a cave. He knew the end was near. He issued one final order to his crumbling army, a document that chills the blood even today. He wrote, "We will advance to attack the American devils and die a death of honor. Each man will kill 10 Americans before he dies." On the American side, the 105th Infantry, Ben Salomon's unit, was moved to the front line on the western coast. They were told to dig in for the night. They were tired. They were complacent. They thought the Japanese were finished. Intelligence reports said the enemy was disorganized and incapable of offensive action. Those reports were wrong. Dead wrong. Less than 1,000 yards away, in the darkness of the ravines, a human tide was gathering. It wasn't just soldiers. It was the walking wounded. Men with no rifles, armed only with rocks and spears made of bamboo. Men with bandages wrapped around their heads, limping on crutches. Even civilians joined the ranks. 3,000 souls. They were not planning a battle. They were planning an avalanche, a suicide charge designed to overwhelm the Americans through sheer weight of numbers. Captain Salomon set up his aid station just 50 yards behind the front-line foxholes. In hindsight, this was a fatal mistake, but the terrain left him no choice. The ground was cramped, and the ravines were steep. He had 30 severely wounded men in his tent. He was running low on morphine. As the sun went down on July 6th, a strange, heavy silence fell over the Tanapag Plain. Veterans will tell you that the jungle is never silent. If the insects stop buzzing, it means something is hunting. Ben Salomon checked his patients. He cleaned his instruments. And then he did something unusual for a medical officer. He checked his M1 Garand rifle, He field-stripped it, oiled the action, and loaded a fresh clip. He checked his pistol. Maybe he felt it. A vibration in the ground, a shift in the air. The dentist was getting ready. At 04:45 a.m. on July 7th, the sun hadn't risen yet. The 105th Infantry was asleep or groggy in their foxholes. Suddenly, a sound tore through the darkness. It started as a low rumble, like a freight train approaching from deep underground. Then, it turned into a scream. A scream from 3,000 throats at once. "Tenno Haika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor! It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. They didn't come in waves. They came as a solid wall of humanity. They crashed into the American perimeter like a tsunami. The front-line foxholes of the 105th were overrun in seconds. American machine gunners fired until their barrels melted, but the Japanese just climbed over the dead bodies of their comrades to get to the Americans. It was hand-to-hand combat immediately. Knives versus swords. Bayonets versus spears. Helmets used as bludgeons. Inside the aid station, Ben Salomon heard the screaming. He heard the wet thud of bodies hitting the ground. Suddenly, the tent flap burst open. A soldier rushed in. But it wasn't an American asking for help. It was a Japanese soldier wielding a bayonet, his eyes wide with the madness of the charge. Salomon didn't hesitate. He was unarmed, holding a medical kit. Instinct took over. He lunged forward, grabbing the Japanese soldier's rifle barrel with his left hand, diverting the blade inches from his chest. With his right hand, he snatched a heavy metal medical pot and smashed it into the attacker's skull. The soldier crumpled. Salomon grabbed a nearby M1 rifle lying on a cot and put 2 rounds into the fallen enemy. But as the gunshot echoed in the small tent, Salomon looked up. Through the open tent flap, illuminated by the hellish glow of flares outside, he saw them. Dozens of them. The front line had collapsed. The safe rear area was now the front line. And between the charging horde and the 30 helpless, bleeding men in his tent stood only one man. At that moment, Ben Salomon made a choice that would cost him his life and earn him a place in legend. He turned to his wounded patients, men who could barely stand, and shouted, "Everybody who can walk, get out! Go back to the regiment! I'll hold them off!" I'll hold them off. One man against an army. The dentist picked up his rifle. He filled his pockets with ammunition. He stepped out of the tent and walked directly into the nightmare. The man who had spent his life fixing smiles was about to unleash hell. Ben Salomon stepped out of that medical tent and into a world that had ceased to make sense. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of cordite, and the metallic tang of blood. It wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a riot of violence. But in this chaos, the dentist found a brutal clarity. He realized instantly that if the Japanese overwhelmed his position, the 30 wounded men crawling away behind him would be butchered. He was the bottleneck. He was the only thing standing between the retreating wounded and the advancing horde. The first few minutes outside the tent were a blur of close-quarters desperation. Salomon didn't start with a machine gun. He started with a rifle he had scavenged from a casualty. He took a knee behind a pile of crates, scanning the darkness. Shapes were moving through the smoke, screaming figures with bayonets fixed. He fired, reloaded, fired again. His movements were mechanical, precise, the muscle memory of the expert marksman taking over the hands of the surgeon. He wasn't panicking. While other men were breaking under the sheer psychological terror of the banzai charge, Salomon was calculating angles. He spotted 4 Japanese soldiers crawling through the underbrush near the tent's right flank. They were trying to cut off the retreat. Salomon stood up, exposed to enemy fire, and engaged them. One shot, two shots, three, four. All targets down. But for every soldier he dropped, three more appeared from the gloom. The sheer weight of numbers was suffocating. He needed more firepower. He needed something that could stop a wave. 50 yards ahead, he saw it. A heavy machine gun position. It was an American M1917 Browning water-cooled machine gun, a beast of a weapon capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. But the gun was silent. The crew lay dead around it, cut down in the opening seconds of the charge. The weapon sat there, unmanned, pointing directly into the heart of the Japanese advance. Salomon didn't hesitate. He threw down his rifle and sprinted across the open ground. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. He dove into the foxhole, landing on top of the dead gunners. He didn't have time to mourn them. He grabbed the handles of the heavy machine gun. It was hot to the touch. He checked the ammo belt. It was loaded. He racked the bolt. This was the moment the battle changed. The Japanese thought they had broken the line. They thought the path to the beach was clear. They were wrong. They had just woken up a monster. The M1917 roared to life. The sound was deafening, a continuous rhythmic hammering that cut through the screams of the banzai charge. Salomon swept the barrel left to right, spraying a cone of lead into the ravines where the enemy was thickest. The effect was devastating. The first wave of attackers, clustered together in a tight mass, was shredded. They fell in heaps, tripping over each other. But still, they came. This is where the story defies belief. A machine gun is usually operated by a team of 3 or 4 men. One to fire, one to feed the ammunition belt, one to spot targets, and one to carry cooling water. Ben Salomon was doing it all alone. He was firing with one hand, feeding the belt with the other, kicking empty ammo crates out of the way with his feet. For the next hour, Ben Salomon became a magnet for every Japanese soldier in the sector. They saw the muzzle flash. They knew that this one gun was the anchor of the American defense. They turned their fury toward him. The first wound came early. A Japanese bullet slammed into his leg. The impact would have knocked a lesser man unconscious. But Salomon barely flinched. He tied a tourniquet around his thigh, gritted his teeth, and kept firing. The pain must have been blinding, but adrenaline is a powerful drug. He knew that if he stopped firing for even 10 seconds, the enemy would be on top of him. Then came the second wave. This wasn't a mindless charge. This was a coordinated attack to take out the gun. A squad of Japanese soldiers flanked him from the right. They crept up through the tall grass, using the noise of the battle to mask their approach. Salomon didn't see them until they were 30 yards away. He swiveled the heavy gun, the tripod groaning under the strain, and unleashed a burst of fire. He caught them in the open. But one soldier managed to throw a grenade before he died. The explosion rocked the foxhole. Shrapnel tore into Salomon's shoulder and chest. He was thrown backward, his ears ringing, blood pouring from multiple wounds. Most men would have stayed down. Most men would have played dead and prayed for the end. Ben Salomon pulled himself back up to the gun. His uniform was soaked in blood. His left arm was useless, hanging limp at his side. He used his good arm to traverse the gun, firing in short, controlled bursts. He wasn't just shooting blindly into the night. He was shifting the gun's position. He realized that if he stayed in one spot, the Japanese mortars would zero in on him. So, between waves of attacks, this wounded dentist, bleeding from half a dozen holes, dragged the heavy machine gun, which weighed over 100 pounds with its tripod and water jacket, to new positions. He would fire for 10 minutes, then drag the gun 10 yards to the left. Fire again. Drag it to the right. To the Japanese commanders watching from the ridge, It must have seemed like they were facing an entire platoon of machine guns. They didn't know it was just one dying man, refusing to let go of the trigger. By 06 a.m., the ammunition began to run low. Salomon had fired thousands of rounds. The barrel of the gun was glowing red-hot. The water in the cooling jacket was boiling off, sending plumes of steam into the air, marking his position even more clearly. He had to scavenge. He crawled out of his foxhole, moving among the dead bodies of the American soldiers he had tried to save earlier. He stripped ammo belts from their bodies. He found rifles and grenades. He dragged everything back to his nest. It was during one of these supply runs that he was hit again. Another bullet to the stomach. The damage was catastrophic. At this point, Ben Salomon was a dead man walking. He had lost too much blood. His organs were failing. But his mind was still sharp. He knew he wasn't going home. He knew he would never see Milwaukee again. He would never open that dental practice. The only thing left to do was to buy time. Every minute he held this position was another minute for the disorganized American forces behind him to regroup. Every Japanese soldier he killed was one less enemy heading for the main hospital tents in the rear. He crawled back to the gun. His vision was blurring. He was running on pure will. The Japanese realized that bullets weren't stopping him, so they decided to rush him. A group of soldiers, led by an officer with a sword, charged directly at the foxhole. They were screaming, sprinting through the devastating fire. Salomon waited. He waited until they were so close he could see the sweat on their faces. He waited until he could see the whites of their eyes. Then he held the trigger down. The machine gun hammered. The officer disintegrated. The soldiers behind him fell like dominoes. But one of them got close enough. A bayonet thrust. It pierced Salomon's side. Salomon didn't let go of the gun. He turned the weapon point blank on the attacker. The blast blew the soldier backward. Salomon was now fighting hand-to-hand while operating a crew-served weapon. He was bleeding from at least 20 wounds. He was surrounded by a ring of dead bodies that was growing higher and higher, actually blocking his field of fire. He had to pause to push the corpses of his enemies out of the way so he could keep shooting. Think about that image. A lone man, surrounded by a wall of the dead, pushing them aside just to kill more. It is a level of primal violence that the human mind struggles to comprehend. As the sun began to rise, the battlefield was illuminated in a gruesome gray light. The Japanese attacks became more desperate. They could see him now. They saw a lone figure, slumped over the gun. His white medical coat turned completely red. They must have thought he was a demon. How could a human being sustain that much damage and keep fighting? Around 06:30 a.m., Captain Salomon realized the end was coming. He had one ammo belt left, maybe 200 rounds. He could hear the Japanese regrouping for a final massive push. They were gathering in the tree line, hundreds of them, preparing to swarm the position once and for all. He looked back toward the command post. It was quiet. The wounded had escaped. The regiment had fallen back to a secondary line of defense. He had done his job. He could have tried to crawl away into the bushes. He could have tried to save himself in these final moments. But Ben Salomon didn't move an inch. He adjusted the tripod one last time. He checked the feed tray. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smoke of the battlefield. He knew what was coming, and he was ready to meet it. The final wave hit at 06:45. It was a tidal wave of bodies. They came from the front, the left, and the right. Salomon opened fire. The gun chattered its death rattle. He swept the barrel back and forth. desperate to hold them back for just one more second, just one more heartbeat. We don't know his final thoughts. We don't know if he thought of his family, or his home, or the men he had saved. All we know is what the evidence told us later. We know that he kept firing until the belt ran dry. We know that even when the gun clicked empty, he didn't surrender. When the ammunition was gone, he stood up. He drew his pistol. He fired until it was empty. He threw the empty pistol at the rushing soldiers. He picked up a knife. The last thing Ben Salomon did on this earth was fight. He fought with bullets, then with steel, and finally, with his bare hands. He fought until his heart stopped beating. He fought until the sheer number of bayonets overwhelmed him. He went down under a pile of enemy soldiers, still swinging, still defiant. The gun fell silent. The screaming stopped. The dentist of Saipan was dead, but the silence that followed was heavy. The Japanese soldiers who survived that assault stood over his body in shock. They looked at the carnage around this one foxhole. They looked at the 98 of their own comrades lying dead in a semicircle around this single man. They must have wondered what kind of warrior they had just killed. They didn't know he was a doctor. They didn't know he was a gentle soul who loved classical music. They only knew they had met a god of war. For the next few hours, the battle raged on elsewhere, but the position held by Ben Salomon remained quiet. The Japanese didn't push past him. He had broken the spine of their attack in that sector. His one-man stand had shattered their momentum. By the time the American forces launched their counterattack later that day, the enemy was spent. But the story doesn't end with his death. In fact, the true mystery and the tragedy was just beginning. Because when the American reinforcements finally retook the position on the afternoon of July 8th, what they found was so unbelievable, so grotesque in its scale, that the army initially refused to believe it. The officers who walked up to that foxhole saw the body of Captain Salomon. They saw the heavy machine gun, the barrel warped from the heat, and they began to count. 1, 5, 10, 20, 50. The count kept going. They counted bodies piled in the tent. They counted bodies stacked like sandbags in front of the gun. They counted bodies in the ravines. 98. 98 enemy soldiers. 1 American. The regimental commander stared at the scene, his face pale. He turned to his aide and said, "I have never seen anything like this in my life." He immediately pulled out his notebook and began to write a recommendation. He was writing a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. It was the most obvious, clear-cut case for the nation's highest award that anyone had ever seen. But Ben Salomon wouldn't get the Medal of Honor. Not that day, not that year, not even in that century. Instead, the file on Ben Salomon would disappear. The recommendation would be rejected. The hero of Saipan would be buried, and his story would be buried with him. The reason? A technicality. A bizarre, bureaucratic rule buried deep in the Geneva Convention that said medical personnel could not bear arms against the enemy. The army looked at the 98 dead bodies and said, "A doctor isn't allowed to do that." And so, the man who saved a regiment was erased from history. For 50 years, his file gathered dust in a Pentagon basement. For 50 years, the men he saved grew old, had children and grandchildren, while the man who gave them that chance was forgotten. But the truth has a way of fighting its way to the surface, just like Ben Salomon fought his way through that night. It would take a new generation of investigators, a relentless push for justice, and a battle against the military bureaucracy to finally uncover what really happened in that foxhole. The smoke cleared over Saipan on July 8, 1944. the sounds of screaming and machine gun. Fire were replaced by the heavy, mechanical rumble of bulldozers burying the dead. But while the physical battle for the island was ending, a new war was just beginning. This wasn't a war fought with bullets or bayonets. It was a war fought with paper, red tape, and a military bureaucracy that refused to believe what had happened in that foxhole. When the division commander, General George Greiner, inspected Ben Salomon's position, he knew he was looking at a Medal of Honor action. The evidence was undeniable. 98 enemy bodies, 1 defender. It was the definition of conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Greiner wrote the recommendation immediately. He gathered witness statements from the wounded men Salomon had saved. He detailed the timelines. He sent the packet up the chain of command, expecting a swift approval. Instead, the recommendation hit a brick wall. The packet landed on the desk of Major General Robert Richardson. Richardson was a stickler for the rules, and he found a problem. A massive legal problem. Captain Ben Salomon was a medical officer. He wore the Red Cross brassard on his arm. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel are classified as non-combatants. They are allowed to carry weapons, but only for self-defense and the defense of their patients. Richardson argued that manning a heavy machine gun and killing 98 people looked a lot like offensive action. He argued that by picking up that weapon, Ben Salomon had violated the Geneva Convention. The general's logic was cold and absolute. A doctor cannot be a machine gunner. If the Army awarded the Medal of Honor to a dentist for slaughtering enemy soldiers, it would strip the Red Cross of its neutrality. It would endanger medical personnel in every future war. So, the recommendation was denied. Think about the cruelty of that decision. Ben Salomon had died protecting the helpless. He had stood his ground when combat infantrymen had run away. And now, the very institution he died for was telling him that he had done his job too well. They were saying that if he had killed 5 people with a pistol, he might be a hero. But because he killed 98 with a machine gun, he was a war criminal. The file on Ben Salomon was closed. It was shoved into a cardboard box and sent to the military archives in St. Louis. And then, in 1973, a massive fire ripped through those archives. Millions of service records were turned to ash. It seemed that the story of the dentist of Saipan was destined to disappear forever. Just smoke and rumors whispered by old veterans at reunions. Decades passed. The men of the 27th Division grew old. The world moved on. We fought in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. The name Ben Salomon meant nothing to the modern army. But history has a way of haunting us. In the late 1990s, a man named Dr. Robert West picked up the scent. West was also a dentist and an alumnus of the same USC dental school where Salomon had studied. He had heard the rumors of the hero dentist and couldn't let it go. He felt a personal duty to find the truth. Dr. West began a crusade. He teamed up with military historians and dug through the surviving records. They found copies of the original witness statements that had escaped the fire. They found the original casualty reports. And most importantly, they found the ballistic analysis from 1944. Dr. West built a legal case. He argued that the general's rejection in 1944 was based on a lie. He proved, using the position of the bodies, that Ben Salomon was not on the offensive. He hadn't hunted the Japanese. They had overrun him. He was defending a fixed position against a suicide charge. The machine gun wasn't a tool of aggression. It was a shield for the wounded men crawling away behind him. The fight took years. The Army resisted. The Pentagon didn't want to reopen a case from half a century ago. They told Dr. West to give up. But he didn't. He rallied congressmen. He rallied the surviving members of the 27th Division. He turned Ben Salomon's name into a political battering ram. Finally, in 2002, the walls crumbled. The Secretary of the Army reviewed the new evidence and admitted the mistake. They acknowledged that the interpretation of the Geneva Convention had been wrong. Ben Salomon hadn't violated the rules of war. He had exemplified the highest tragedy of war, that sometimes, to save lives, a healer must become a killer. On May 1, 2002, 58 years after he died in the mud of Saipan, Ben Salomon was invited to the White House. Obviously, Ben couldn't be there. He had no wife. He had no children. His bloodline had ended in that foxhole. So, a distant relative, a cousin named Dr. Robert West, the very man who fought for his legacy, stood in the Rose Garden. President George W. Bush stood at the podium. The sun was shining. The Marines were standing at attention. And the president read the citation. He spoke of the 98 enemy soldiers. He spoke of the wounds. He spoke of the sacrifice. Captain Ben Salomon, the president said, was a dentist who just wanted to fix teeth. But when the hour of darkness came, he stood tall. The president handed the Medal of Honor to Dr. West. It was the final Medal of Honor awarded for World War II. The last chapter of the greatest conflict in human history was closed by a dentist. Today, if you go to the University of Southern California School of Dentistry, you will see the medal on display. Students walk past it every day on their way to class. Most of them are worried about exams, about tuition, about their future careers, just like Ben was in 1937. They look at the photo of the gentle man in the wire-rimmed glasses, and they see themselves. But Ben Salomon represents something terrifying and beautiful inside all of us. He proves that we don't truly know who we are until the sky falls. He proves that a man who spends a lifetime healing can, in a single heartbeat, become a warrior capable of stopping an army. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be a killer. He just wanted to make sure his patients got home. And for that, he paid the ultimate price. 98 enemies. One dentist. No surrender. This is the story the history books tried to forget. But we remember. If this story shook you, if you believe that Ben Salomon deserves to be known by the entire world, do your part right now. Hit that like button. It helps the algorithm push this hero's story to millions of people who have never heard his name. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we are digging up the lost files of history every single week. And I want you to go to the comments section below. I want you to type just one word: respect. Let's fill the comments with respect for the dentist of Saipan. Let's make sure that 80 years later, his sacrifice is acknowledged. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. We'll see you in the next one. It weighed 56 tons. It carried an 88mm cannon that could slice through a building like a hot knife through butter. Its frontal armor was so thick that Allied shells simply bounced off it like pebbles thrown at a wall. It was a Tiger I, the apex predator of World War II. According to every military manual in existence, the woman standing in the doorway is already dead. You do not fight a Tiger tank with kitchenware. You run, you hide, or you die. But on a Tuesday morning in 1944, in a city burning to the ground, the manuals were wrong. Physics doesn't care about military doctrine. And this woman was about to prove that a $50 piece of cast iron could do what $1 million of anti-tank weaponry couldn't. She didn't just stop the tank. She humiliated it. To understand why a simple frying pan became a weapon of legendary status, you first have to understand the absolute nightmare it was up against. By the summer of 1944, the German Panzerwaffe had created a psychological terror that paralyzed not just civilians, but hardened soldiers. They called it tiger phobia. It was a medically recognized condition among Allied troops. Men would freeze. They would panic. They would abandon their positions at the mere sound of that engine. And what a sound it was! The Tiger was powered by a massive Maybach HL-230 engine. When it started up, it didn't just hum. It roared with a guttural mechanical scream that vibrated through the cobblestones and into your bones. In the narrow streets of Warsaw, you felt a tiger before you saw it. The water in the puddles would tremble. The glass in the windows would rattle until it shattered. It was the sound of impending death. The Panzer VI, the Tiger, wasn't just a tank. It was a moving fortress designed by engineers who were obsessed with invincibility. The frontal armor was 100 millimeters of hardened, face-hardened steel. To put that in perspective, an American Sherman tank or a British Cromwell had to get within suicidal range, sometimes less than 500 yards, just to scratch the paint. Meanwhile, the Tiger could kill them from 2 kilometers away. It could park at the end of a long avenue and destroy anything that moved for 20 blocks. It was a machine built for open fields, for dominating the steppes of Russia. But now, in 1944, it was being used for something much darker. It was being used to crush a city block by block. For the resistance fighters trapped in occupied Warsaw, the situation was beyond hopeless. These weren't soldiers with air support. They didn't have artillery batteries. They didn't have radios to call in airstrikes. These were teachers, mechanics, nurses, university students, and grandmothers. They were fighting in the streets wearing their civilian clothes, armed with stolen pistols, hunting rifles, and rusty grenades from the First World War. They were the Home Army, the AK, and they were fighting the most mechanized army in a history with little more than courage and rage. When a Tiger rolled into a city square, the resistance usually died. It was simple, brutal math. A Molotov cocktail might scorch the paint, but unless you hit the engine vents perfectly, the tank kept moving. A grenade against the tracks? The Tiger's tracks were solid steel plates, wider than a man's chest. It would just crush the grenade and the thrower instantly. The resistance watched in horror as their bullets pinged harmlessly off the steel hide of these monsters. They watched as the Tigers slowly, methodically rotated their turrets, leveling apartment buildings where families were hiding. They realized quickly that bravery wasn't enough. You can't be brave against a 56-ton wall of steel. You have to be smart, or you have to be insane. By August 1944, Warsaw was being suffocated. The Germans had deployed special units designed specifically to level the city. They brought in the Sturmtiger, a hideous beast firing a rocket-propelled depth charge that could destroy an entire building with one shot. They brought in the Goliath tracked mines, remote-controlled bombs that scurried across the rubble like mechanical beetles to blow up barricades. The city was turning into a moonscape of jagged concrete and twisted rebar. The resistance needed a miracle. But miracles were in short supply, so they turned to science. Desperate, basement science. In the cellars of ruined buildings, beneath the constant shelling, a strange kind of weapons development was evolving. Resistance fighters, chemistry students, and factory workers gathered to solve one problem. How do you kill a Tiger without an anti-tank gun? They tried everything, and usually, people died trying. First, they tried the sticky bomb. The concept was borrowed from the British. They took socks, ordinary wool socks, and filled them with plastic explosives and covered them in thick, heavy axle grease. The idea was that a runner would sprint up to the tank, slam the sticky sock onto the metal, pull the fuse, and run. In theory, the grease would hold the bomb against the armor until it detonated. In practice, it was a disaster. The grease would pick up dust and debris from the ruins, losing its stickiness. The brave runner would slap the bomb against the tank, and it would simply slide off and fall to the ground, exploding harmlessly while the tank machine-gunned the runner. Then they tried the petrol catapults. They built makeshift catapults from bed springs and floorboards to launch Molotov cocktails from behind barricades. But the Tiger's engine deck was high, and the bottles often shattered on the frontal armor, creating a wall of fire that blinded the driver for a moment but didn't stop the tank. The tank would simply drive through the fire, crushing the barricade and everyone behind it. They even tried blinding attacks. This was the most tragic chapter of the uprising. Groups of children, nicknamed the Little Tigers, would volunteer for suicide missions. They would run out with wet blankets, coats, or buckets of mud, trying to cover the viewports of the tank. It was an act of supreme heroism. But the Germans learned quickly. They began marching infantry alongside the tanks specifically to pick off these runners. A child would sprint from a doorway, blanket in hand, only to be cut down before they got within 10 yards. The tanks seemed unstoppable. They seemed to have an answer for everything. The morale in the resistance began to break. How do you fight a god of war? You see your friends die trying to scratch it. You see your barricades crushed like matchsticks. The Tiger became a symbol of inevitable defeat. When the rumble of that Maybach engine echoed down the street, fighters would look at each other and check their last bullets, saving one for themselves. But in the chaos of Sector 4, in the Old Town district, one woman was watching the tanks with a different perspective. She wasn't a soldier. She hadn't been trained at a military academy. She was a cook. Her name is lost to some history books, often referred to as Magda, or simply the Iron Lady of Old Town. But her observation would change everything. She didn't look at the tank as a weapon. She looked at it as a machine. And as a cook, she understood that every machine, like every oven, needs to breathe. Magda spent days watching from a cracked third-floor window. She watched the Tigers moving through the narrow, rubble-choked streets. She noticed something the soldiers missed. The soldiers were looking at the gun barrel, terrified of where it was pointing. Magda was looking at the back of the tank. She noticed that the Tiger, for all its armor and power, was a delicate beast. It was over-engineered. The immense engine generated a colossal amount of heat. To keep from melting down, the Tiger needed constant, massive airflow. The air intake vents were located on the rear deck, flat grills that sucked in thousands of cubic feet of air every minute. She also noticed the behavior of the crews. In the open fields of Russia, the Tiger was king. But here, in the claustrophobic alleys of Warsaw, the crews were terrified. They were buttoned up tight. They couldn't see what was directly beside or behind them. The tank had massive blind spots. If you were standing 3 meters away from the side, the gunner couldn't see you. The driver couldn't see you. You were invisible. Magda realized the tank had 2 weaknesses. It was blind, and it was breathless. The legend of the frying pan didn't start as a calculated military operation. It started, like many great inventions, with a mistake. A desperate, terrified accident. It happened during a raid near the market square. A German Panzer III, a smaller cousin of the Tiger, was inching down a narrow alleyway, hunting for a resistance radio post. The fighters in the building above were out of ammo. They were out of grenades. They were out of options. The tank stopped directly below their window, its turret swiveling to blast the entrance. In the kitchen on the second floor, A fighter named Jan panicked. He grabbed the first heavy object his hand touched, a large cast-iron skillet that had been used to fry pork fat earlier that morning. It was heavy, black, and still slick with grease. With a scream of frustration, Jan hurled the heavy pan out the window. He wasn't aiming. He just wanted to hit the thing. The pan spun through the air. It didn't hit the turret. It didn't hit the barrel. It landed flat, with a loud metallic clang, directly onto the rear engine deck of the Panzer. Physics took over. The pan was heavy, so the wind didn't catch it. It was flat. And because it was coated in grease, and the engine deck was hot, it didn't bounce off. It slid. It slid across the metal grating like a hockey puck on ice until it slammed up against the turret ring housing. And there it sat, covering the main air intake vent. What happened next was something no one expected. Inside the tank, the dynamics changed instantly. The massive engine, suddenly starved of oxygen, began to choke. The mixture of fuel and air became too rich. The engine sputtered. Thick, black, oily smoke began to pour out of the exhaust, then out of the intake itself. To the crew inside, this wasn't a pan. To them, the sudden loss of power, the choking engine, and the smell of burning oil meant one thing: fire. They thought a petrol bomb had hit the engine. They thought the fuel lines were burning. In a tank, fire is the ultimate horror. You have seconds to get out before you burn alive. The hatch flew open. The crew bailed out, hands in the air, coughing, expecting flames. They were met by resistance fighters who held them at gunpoint, confused. The fighters looked at the tank. There was no fire. There was no bomb. There was just a frying pan, sitting innocently on the back deck, choking the life out of the engine. News of the pan incident spread through the resistance channels like wildfire. Most men laughed it off as a freak occurrence. "A lucky throw," they said. "It won't happen again." You can't fight a war with cookware. But Magda didn't laugh. She stopped cooking and started calculating. She went to the abandoned kitchens of the district. She gathered skillets, heavy ones, cast iron. She realized that the pan wasn't just a heavy object. It was the perfect shape. It was a disc. It was aerodynamic. And crucially, it was hollow on one side. The Germans had a weapon called the Haftladung, a magnetic-shaped charge anti-tank mine. It was effective, but it was heavy, complex, and the resistance didn't have any. Magda realized she could build a primitive version of this using household items. She gathered a group of young women in a basement. These weren't soldiers. They were the runners, the fastest sprinters in the district. She showed them the pan. "This," she said, "is better than a grenade. A grenade bounces. A grenade explodes too early. This sticks." She developed a modification. They would pack the underside of the pan, the hollow part, with a mixture of tar and a sticky explosive compound if they had it. If they didn't have explosives, they would use a thick paste of flour and gasoline, or simply heavy grease. The goal wasn't always to blow up the tank. The goal was to seal the vents, to suffocate the monster. But there was a catch, a terrifying catch. To use the iron skillet tactic, you couldn't throw it from a window. You couldn't rely on a lucky toss. You had to place it. You had to run up to the tank, enter the dead zone, climb onto the back deck while the tank was moving, and slam the pan down over the vents. It was a suicide mission. It required nerves of steel. You had to let the tank pass you. You had to wait until the machine gun couldn't turn to hit you. You had to sprint through the dust, grab the hot metal of the tank, pull yourself up, and deliver the payload. Magda called for volunteers. The men hesitated. It seemed insane. Run up to a tiger tank with a frying pan? But the women of the resistance stepped forward. They were tired of hiding. They were tired of starving. They understood the logic. If the men fought with guns, the women would fight with guile. They practiced on a wrecked truck, sprinting, climbing, slapping the pan down. The sound, clang, became their rhythm. They learned to wrap the handle in rags so their hands wouldn't slip on sweat. They learned to move in pairs, one to distract the turret with rifle fire, the other to run. The test came sooner than expected. August 14, 1944. The ground began to shake in Sector 4. Dust fell from the ceiling of their basement HQ. The lookouts shouted the warning. "King Tiger! King Tiger coming north!" This wasn't just a tiger eye. This was the Tiger II. The Königstiger, 70 tons, sloped armor that made it virtually impervious to any Allied gun in existence. It was a behemoth, a moving mountain of steel that could crush a house without slowing down. It was heading straight for the refugee hospital in the old town. The resistance had no anti-tank weapons left. The Piat launcher was broken. The last gammon bomb had been used yesterday. There was nothing between the King Tiger and the hospital except rubble and Magda's squad. Magda looked at the young woman next to her, a girl named Iwa, barely 20 years old, a former nursing student. Iwa looked terrified. Her hands were shaking, but she reached down and picked up the heavy black cast-iron skillet. The bottom was packed with a sticky, tar-like explosive mixture. "Wait for the dust," Magda whispered. "Wait for the turn." The sound of the King Tiger was deafening now. The squeal of the tracks was like a banshee screaming. The tank turned the corner, its massive 80mm barrel sweeping across the street, knocking over a lamppost. It paused. The commander opened the hatch to survey the debris. Magda nodded. The sniper on the roof fired a single shot, pinging off the commander's cupola. The commander ducked back inside. The hatch clanged shut. The tank was buttoned up. Blind. Iwa took a breath. She gripped the handle of the pan. And then she ran. She sprinted out of the doorway, a blur of gray dress and determination, charging straight at the 70-ton monster. This is where the history books usually end the chapter, with the brave charge. But we are going to slow this down, because what happened in the next 10 seconds defied every law of warfare. Ewa didn't get shot. She entered the dust cloud. She reached the side of the moving tank, she grabbed the tow cable, and she pulled herself up onto the back of the beast. She was now riding the Tiger. The heat from the engine burned through her shoes. The vibration rattled her teeth. She scrambled to the center of the deck, looked for the main intake grill, raised the iron pan high above her head like a hammer of the gods, and slammed it down. The metal screamed. Clang! Iwa slammed the iron skillet down onto the King Tiger's primary intake vent. The impact didn't sound like a weapon. It sounded like a church bell ringing in hell. The tar and sticky explosives packed into the hollow underside of the pan instantly began to melt and fuse with the scorching hot metal of the tank's grill. Ewa didn't wait to see if it worked. She rolled off the side of the moving 70-ton monster, hitting the cobblestones hard, tumbling into the ruins just as the tank's turret began to rotate toward her. But the turret never finished its turn. Inside the beast, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The King Tiger's Maybach engine was a hungry animal. It gulped massive amounts of air to function. Iwa's pan had just clamped a hand over its mouth. The sticky mixture sealed the vent. The airflow was cut by 80% in a fraction of a second. The engine didn't just stall, it suffocated. The fuel injectors kept pumping gasoline, but there was no air to burn it efficiently. The mixture became critically rich. A violent backfire shook the massive vehicle. Black, oily smoke, unable to escape through the blocked vents, was forced back into the engine compartment and then, crucially, into the crew cabin. The German crew inside didn't know they had been attacked by cookware. All they knew was that their invincible fortress was suddenly filled with choking fumes, and the engine was dying. The commander shouted orders, but he couldn't be heard over the coughing. The temperature inside the tank spiked. They assumed the worst. Catastrophic engine fire. Ammunition cook-off imminent. The hatch flew open. The crew scrambled out, gasping for air, their faces blackened with soot. They jumped from the deck, hands raised, surrendering to the empty ruins, terrified that their own machine was about to explode. Ewa watched from behind a pile of bricks, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the explosion, but there was no explosion. The tank just sat there, silent, smoking, defeated. A piece of kitchen equipment worth a few zlotus had just neutralized the most advanced, expensive, and terrifying land weapon on Earth. The resistance fighters emerged from the shadows. They didn't fire their guns. They just stared. They walked up to the silent King Tiger. One of them climbed up and looked at the engine deck. There it was, the black iron skillet, fused to the vent, looking ridiculous and triumphant against the camouflage paint. That moment changed the war in Sector 4. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological earthquake. The fear broke. The tiger phobia evaporated. The resistance realized that the monsters were just machines, and machines could be broken by anyone brave enough to get close. Magda didn't celebrate. She knew this was just the beginning. One tank was luck, two was a pattern. But to save the district, they needed a factory. She took over the basement of a bombed-out bakery. This became the Iron Works. It was perhaps the strangest weapons factory of World War II. There were no conveyor belts, no precision tools. There were just tables covered in pots, pans, kettles, and buckets. Magda organized the women of the district. They scoured the ruins. Every abandoned apartment was raided. They weren't looking for gold or jewelry. They were looking for cast iron. Skillets were the prize, but heavy lids, Dutch ovens, and even metal serving trays were collected. They refined the science. They learned that the sticky mixture was key. They raided a damaged pharmacy for chemicals and a hardware store for roofing tar. They created a black, viscous paste they called the gunk. It had to be sticky enough to hold the metal plate to the tank, but stable enough not to explode while the runner was carrying it. They also realized that different tanks had different lungs. The Tiger I had vents on the top deck. The Panther had them on the sides. The smaller Panzer IV had louvers. Magda created a cookbook, literally a handwritten notebook with sketches of German tanks, marking exactly where the pan needed to be placed for maximum suffocation. It became a standardized weapon, the Magda Mine. It consisted of a heavy iron pan filled with the gunk, sometimes spiked with a blasting cap to fuse the metal, sometimes just relying on the heat. The handle was wrapped in cloth tape for grip. But building the weapon was the easy part. The hard part was the delivery system, the human delivery system. Magda established a training course in the courtyard. It was brutal. She knew that hesitation meant death. The runners, mostly young women, because they were faster and lighter, had to practice sprinting with a heavy weight. They had to learn how to vault onto a moving truck. They had to learn the Tiger rhythm. The Tiger tank had a rhythm to its movement. It would lurch, stop, rotate, and move. You had to move when it stopped. You had to freeze when it moved. You had to exploit the blind spots. Magda taught them to watch the commander's cupola. "If the hatch is open," she said, you are dead. If the hatch is closed, the beast is blind. By late August, the German commanders were confused and angry. Reports were coming in from the Old Town sector of tanks being disabled without being hit by anti-tank fire. Crews were reporting phantom mines that appeared on their engine decks. When they recovered the disabled tanks, they found the pans. At first, they thought it was a joke, a mockery. But when the engineers analyzed the fused metal and the scorched engines, they realized the brilliance of it. The resistance was using the tank's own heat against it. The German response was ruthless. They issued a new order: Infantry Support Doctrine. No tank was to move without a squad of grenadiers walking directly beside it. These soldiers were ordered to watch the rooftops and, more importantly, watch the dead zone around the tank. They were ordered to shoot anyone carrying anything. The streets became a slaughterhouse. The first few runners who tried the pan tactic after the new orders were cut down instantly. Iwa watched her friend, a girl named Zofia, sprint toward a Panther tank, only to be machine-gunned by a soldier hiding behind the treads. Zofia fell, the heavy pan clattering onto the cobblestones beside her. The tank rolled over both of them. The tactic was failing. The resistance morale plummeted again. You can't run up to a tank if it has 10 bodyguards. Magda sat in the bakery basement, staring at her pile of unused pans. The women looked at her, waiting. The tanks were advancing again. The hospital was under fire. They needed a new angle. Magda looked at the pans. Then she looked at the rubble. She realized that they had been attacking the tank where it was strongest, on the street level. But the city was vertical. The ruins were 4 stories high. "We don't run to them," she said. "We let them come to us." She developed the drop. They couldn't get close enough to place the pans by hand anymore. So they would drop them. They would use gravity. It required incredible precision. They had to lure a tank to stop directly under a specific window or balcony. This meant using bait. A fighter would fire a few shots from a basement window to draw the tank's attention. The tank would stop, rotate its turret to blast the basement. And in that moment, while the tank was stationary and focused on the kill, a runner 3 floors up would lean out. But dropping a frying pan isn't like dropping a bomb. If it hits the wrong way, it bounces off. It has to land flat. Magda experimented. She added cloth streamers to the handle of the pans, like tails on a kite. This stabilized the fall. It ensured the pan would flip and land face down, sticky side down. The first test of the drop was the most terrifying moment of the entire campaign. A squad of 3 Panzer IV was moving down Kilinsky Street. The infantry was guarding the sides perfectly. No runner could get through. Magda and Ewa were on the 3rd floor of a shelled-out apartment block. The floor was sagging. The walls were gone. They were exposed. The lead tank rumbled below. The infantry scanned the street level, looking for runners. They didn't look up. Why would they? Who drops cookware from the sky? Magda held the modified pan. It was heavy. Her arms shook. She signaled the bait team below. A single shot rang out from the basement across the street. The lead tank stopped violently. The turret whined as it spun left. The infantry took cover, aiming at the basement. The tank was still. Magda leaned out. She didn't throw it. She just let go. Time seemed to slow down. The black iron disc fell for 2 seconds. It spiraled slightly, the cloth tail correcting its angle. Clang! It was perfect. It hit the engine louvers dead center. The impact was loud enough to startle the infantry below. They looked up, confused, but it was too late. The sticky bomb fused. The engine choked. But Magda wasn't done. "Now!" she screamed. From the windows all along the street, other women appeared. It was an ambush, but not with guns. It was a rain of iron. Pans, pots, weighted metal trays, anything heavy and sticky, rained down on the column. The second tank was hit on the turret ring. The pan jammed the mechanism. The gunner tried to traverse, and the gears stripped with a horrible screeching sound. The tank was effectively disarmed. The third tank tried to reverse, but the driver, in his panic, backed into a pile of rubble and threw a track. The infantry below fired wildly at the windows, but the women were already gone, disappearing into the labyrinth of the ruins. In the street below, chaos reigned. The lead tank was smoking. The second tank was spinning its turret uselessly. The third was immobilized. The invincible German armor column had been halted by gravity and kitchen supplies. The success of the drop changed the geometry of the battle. The Germans could no longer just watch the street. They had to watch every window, every balcony, every hole in every wall. It slowed them down. They had to move at a snail's pace, blasting every upper floor before advancing. This bought the resistance time, precious time. It allowed them to evacuate the hospital. It allowed them to move weapons. It allowed them to survive. But the Germans were not stupid. They adapted again. They called in the Luftwaffe. If they couldn't take the buildings, they would flatten them from the air. The Stukas arrived. The bombing began. Magda knew their time was running out. The bakery was hit. The iron works was buried under tons of brick. They dug themselves out, coughing, bleeding. They had saved many pans, but they had lost their base. Ewa looked at Magda. "What now?" she asked. "We have no factory. We have no high ground." Magda wiped the blood from her forehead. She looked at the surviving women. She looked at the last few remaining pans. "We still have the sewers," she said. "If they couldn't attack from the sides, and they couldn't attack from above, they would attack from below." The sewers of Warsaw were never meant to be inhabited by humans. They were narrow, waist-deep in sludge, pitch black, and filled with the stench of a dying city. But by September 1944, they were the last highway of the resistance. And they became the final laboratory for Magda's war against the machines. Magda realized that while the Germans controlled the sky with their Stukas and the streets with their tigers, they did not control the ground beneath their feet. The tanks had a fatal flaw that no amount of frontal armor could fix. To move through the city, they had to drive over manhole covers. The iron skillet tactic evolved one last time. It became the sewer mine. The women worked in the dark, guided only by flashlights with dying batteries. They took the last remaining cast iron pans and modified them. They weren't aerodynamic discs anymore. They were shaped charges. They packed the pans with the last of their explosives, focusing the blast upward. The plan was terrifyingly simple. A spotter would sit just beneath a manhole cover, breathing through a rag to filter out the toxic fumes, listening. They listened for the distinctive heavy crunch of tank treads on the pavement above. When the tank rolled over the manhole, the world would go dark as the steel belly of the beast blocked out the tiny slivers of light. That was the moment. The spotter would push the pan upward, wedging it against the bottom of the tank, the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle, and trigger the fuse. Then they would drop back into the sludge and run. It was a game of Russian roulette, played with 50-ton tanks. If you timed it wrong, the tank tracks would crush the manhole cover, and you along with it. If the fuse was too short, the concussion in the confined sewer tunnel would liquefy your organs. But it worked. On September 2nd, A Panther tank guarding the entrance to the old town suddenly jumped a foot in the air. There was no incoming fire, no soldiers nearby. The tank simply gutted itself from below. The explosion, focused by the shape of the iron pan, punched a hole straight through the floor of the tank, igniting the ammunition storage. The turret blew off. The German crews were horrified. The ground itself was attacking them. They stopped driving over manholes. They started swerving to avoid them, which slowed them down even more, making them vulnerable to snipers. The psychological impact was devastating. The invincible Tiger crews were now afraid of potholes. But attrition is a cruel mathematician. For every tank Magda's team disabled, the Germans sent 2 more. For every resistance fighter who survived the sewers, 3 died from gas, attacks, or exhaustion. The uprising was being crushed. The old town was falling. By late September, the order came to evacuate. The civilians, the wounded from the hospital, and the remaining fighters had to retreat to the city center via the sewers. It was a hellish exodus, thousands of people crawling through filth for hours. But to escape, they needed time. The Germans were pressing in on the sewer entrance at Krasinski Square. A column of armor, led by a Sturmtiger, a monster designed to level entire buildings with rocket-propelled depth charges, was advancing to seal the hole. If the Sturmtiger reached the square, it would collapse the sewer entrance. Thousands would be trapped and slaughtered. Magda looked at Iwa. They had 1 pan left, 1 heavy cast-iron skillet, dented and scarred, packed with the last of their gunk, a volatile mix of scavenged dynamite and tar. They didn't have the high ground. They couldn't use the sewers because the tunnel was full of refugees. They had to do it the old way, the hard way. Magda made the decision. She took the pan. She handed Ewa her notebook, the cookbook of tank vulnerabilities. "You go," she said. "Take the book. Teach the others in the city center." Ewa refused. She wanted to stay. But Magda wasn't asking. She pushed Ewa toward the manhole. "Someone has to tell them how we fought," she said. "Go." Ewa climbed down into the darkness. The last thing she saw was Magda standing in the ruins of a doorway, tightening the cloth tape around the handle of the skillet, waiting for the monster. The Sturmtiger is a blind beast. It has massive armor but very poor visibility. It rumbled into the square, its massive rocket launcher searching for targets. It ignored the lone woman in the dust. Why waste a rocket on one person? Magda didn't run. She didn't hide. She waited until the beast turned its massive gun toward the sewer entrance where the refugees were escaping. And then she charged. It wasn't a sprint of hope. It was a sprint of defiance. The German infantry spotted her. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet. She was hit. She stumbled. But she got up. She reached the side of the Sturmtiger. She didn't have the strength to climb it. She didn't have the strength to reach the vents. So she did the only thing she could. She jammed the heavy iron pan into the gap between the drive sprocket and the track. It shouldn't have worked. A frying pan against a tank track? It's ridiculous. But the pan was made of cast iron. It was brittle, but incredibly hard. It jammed into the teeth of the sprocket. The massive torque of the engine tried to force the track around, but the iron wedge held for just a split second. Crack. The drive pin on the track snapped. The track unraveled like a broken belt. The Sturmtiger lurched to the right, spinning out of control, and slammed into a wall, blocking the street. The tank wasn't destroyed. The crew was alive. But the vehicle was immobilized. It was a 60-ton roadblock. The other tanks behind it couldn't pass. The infantry couldn't advance. Magda fell beside the tracks. She didn't see the refugees escape. She didn't hear the tank crew cursing. She just felt the cold iron of the pan one last time. She had bought them 20 minutes, and 20 minutes was enough to save 1,000 lives. The Warsaw Uprising ended on October 2nd, 1944. It was a defeat. The resistance surrendered. The Germans, on Hitler's personal orders, systematically destroyed what was left of the city. They burned libraries, blew up monuments, and leveled houses. Warsaw became a sea of ruins. 85% of the city was destroyed. Ewa survived. She made it through the sewers to the city center, and then out of the city into a prisoner of war camp. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, grease-stained notebook tucked inside her coat. When the war ended and the Soviets marched in, the story of the uprising was suppressed. The communist regime didn't want to celebrate the heroism of the Home Army. They wanted to erase it. The story of Magda and the iron skillets was whispered in private kitchens, but never spoken aloud in public. The tanks were scrapped. The ruins were rebuilt. The cast-iron pans that had littered the streets of the old town were collected by scavengers and melted down to make new pipes, new beams, new machines. The physical evidence of the kitchen war was erased. But you cannot erase physics, and you cannot erase memory. For decades, military historians analyzed the battle. They looked at the casualty reports. They were baffled by the number of German heavy tanks listed as immobilized due to engine failure or abandoned due to mechanical sabotage in Sector 4. They couldn't understand how a ragtag group of civilians with almost no anti-tank weapons had managed to stall an elite panzer division for 2 months. They blamed it on the poor reliability of the Tiger tanks. They blamed it on the narrow streets. They blamed it on German incompetence. They didn't know about the pans. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the Iron Curtain fell and the archives were opened, that the truth started to emerge. Diaries were published. Ewa, now an old woman living in Chicago, released her memoir. She showed the world the sketches, the Magda mine, the drop calculations, the diagrams of how to choke a tiger with a skillet. So, what is the legacy of this story? Why does it matter today? We live in an age of high-tech warfare. We talk about drones, lasers, and cyber attacks. We assume that technology always wins. We assume that the side with the biggest budget and the thickest armor is invincible. But Magda's story proves a timeless truth. Technology has blind spots. Complexity creates vulnerability. The Tiger tank was a marvel of engineering, but it was defeated by a piece of metal that cost 50 cents. The Germans built a machine to dominate the world, but they forgot to protect its breath. They forgot that even a monster needs air. Magda and the women of the old town didn't win the war. Warsaw fell. The tragedy is real and absolute, but they achieved something else. They broke the spell of invincibility. They proved that resistance is never futile, even when it seems mathematically impossible. They took the most mundane object imaginable, a symbol of domestic life, a frying pan, and turned it into a symbol of defiance. They showed us that when you are fighting for your home, for your family, for your very existence, everything is a weapon. Every time a resistance fighter disabled a tank, they bought time for a child to escape. Every time they stalled a column, they allowed a family to disappear into the shadows. Magda didn't fight to win a medal. She fought for minutes. And those minutes added up to lives. Today, if you walk through the rebuilt old town of Warsaw, you won't find a statue of a woman holding a frying pan. There are monuments to the soldiers, to the guns, to the generals. But if you look closely at the walls of the cathedral, you can still see the pockmarks from the tank shells. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo. the rumble of the engine, the scream of the tracks, and the loud, defiant clang of iron against steel, the sound of a cook declaring war on a king. This story was almost lost to history. It was buried by rubble, by politics, and by time. But we dug it up because stories like this deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, if you felt the heat of the engine and the weight of that iron pan in your hand, then do me a favor. Destroy that like button. It's the only way to tell the algorithm that history matters. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. We are hunting down the most incredible untold stories of World War II every single week, and you do not want to miss the next one. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What is the most desperate, improvised weapon you've ever heard of in history? Was it the sticky bomb, the Molotov, or is it the iron skillet? Let me know down below. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just written by the victors. It's written by the people who refuse to give up. See you in the next one.